What's the secret to making a relationship work when your partner needs space, like other people need air? Here's what nobody tells you about avoidance. They're not broken people who need fixing. They're people who work differently. And when you try to force them into normal relationship patterns, you're asking them to suffocate for your comfort. Most relationship advice assumes everyone wants the same things: constant communication, talking about feelings, regular reassurance about where you stand. But avoidance recharge through alone time, connect through shared activities rather than deep conversations, and show love through being there rather than saying it. When you stop trying to turn them into someone else and start working with who they actually are, something interesting happens. They become more available, not less. They start choosing closeness instead of feeling trapped by it. They begin sharing parts of themselves because they want to, not because they feel pressured to perform. But here's where most people get it wrong. They think accepting an avoidant means becoming a doormat or settling for scraps. That's not what this is about. This is about learning to tell the difference between someone whose natural way of loving is different from what you expected and someone who's just not that into you regardless of their attachment style. The difference shows up in consistency over time. A genuinely invested avoidant will be reliable in practical ways, will include you in their life even if they don't talk about their feelings, and will show care through actions even when they struggle with words. Someone who's just not interested will be inconsistent, will keep you on the outside of their actual life, and will use their avoidant tendencies as an excuse to avoid putting in any real effort. Most relationship advice tells you to communicate more, express your feelings openly, and create deeper connection through vulnerability. With avoidance, this approach doesn't just fail, it actively pushes them away. They see intensity as a threat to their freedom, and they'll start planning their escape the moment they feel cornered into performing emotions. Instead, you need to learn their actual language of connection. Avoidants don't bond through talking about feelings. They bond through shared experiences, being there consistently, and practical partnership. They don't show love through saying it. They show it by including you in their routine, solving problems for you, and choosing to spend their limited social energy on you rather than anyone else. When an avoidant remembers something important you told them weeks ago and follows up without being asked, that's their version of paying attention. When they rearrange their schedule to help you with something practical, that's how they show care. When they invite you into their personal space or include you in activities they usually do alone, that's often deeper intimacy than romantic declarations would be from someone else. Learning to receive love in their language doesn't mean accepting less. It means recognizing when you're actually getting something valuable that looks different from what you expected. Many people starve in relationships with avoidance not because the avoidant isn't showing love, but because they can't recognize love when it comes without traditional romantic packaging. This is where brutal honesty about your own needs becomes essential. Some people genuinely need frequent verbal affirmation, regular processing, and obvious romantic gestures to feel loved. There's nothing wrong with needing these things, but you're probably not compatible with someone whose natural expression of love doesn't include them. Other people find that they actually prefer the drama-free, low-maintenance approach that many avoidants bring to relationships. They value independence, appreciate practical shows of care, and don't need constant reassurance to feel secure. These people often build incredibly stable, long-lasting relationships with avoidance because their natural styles work together rather than fight. Living with an avoidant means restructuring your expectations around availability. They're not going to be your go-to person for support during every crisis. They're not going to want to process relationship dynamics regularly. They're not going to provide constant reassurance about how they feel about you. But what they can provide when they're genuinely invested is remarkable stability. Avoidants don't create drama, they don't play games, they don't need you to manage their insecurities or constantly prove your devotion. Once they've decided you're worth including in their life, they tend to be exceptionally loyal and reliable partners. This trade-off appeals to some people and feels insufficient to others. The key is being honest about which category you fall into, rather than trying to convince yourself you can be happy with something that doesn't actually satisfy you. One of the biggest mistakes people make with avoidance is trying to speed up their timeline. Avoidants don't warm up to people quickly, and they don't express feelings on anyone else's schedule. Pushing them to define the relationship, declare their feelings, or commit to future plans before they're ready usually results in them pulling back or disappearing entirely. This doesn't mean accepting uncertainty forever or letting someone string you along. It means recognizing that avoidants typically show their level of investment through actions over long periods rather than through early declarations. They prove their feelings through consistency, reliability, and gradually increasing inclusion in their life. If an avoidant is genuinely interested in building something with you, you'll see evidence in how they prioritize your needs, make space for you in their routine, and solve practical problems that affect your life together. These shows of care often provide more reliable information about their intentions than verbal reassurances would. The timeline issue becomes particularly important when dealing with major relationship milestones. Avoidants often need significantly more time than other people to feel comfortable with moving in together, meeting family, or making long-term commitments. This isn't necessarily about their feelings for you. It's about their need to preserve their sense of freedom while gradually integrating someone else into their life. Some people can work with this slower timeline because they're also cautious about commitment or because they value how thoroughly avoidants make relationship decisions. Others find the pace frustratingly slow and prefer partners who move toward commitment more quickly. Neither preference is wrong, but recognizing which type you are can save you months or years of frustration trying to speed up someone's natural rhythm or convince yourself that you can be patient when patience doesn't come naturally to you. Communication with avoidance requires completely relearning how to express needs and address problems. Direct, emotional confrontation, sitting them down for serious relationship talks, typically triggers their flight response. They interpret these conversations as attempts to control their emotional space or force them into commitments they're not ready to make. Instead, you need to become skilled at indirect communication that gets your point across without triggering their defenses. Instead of saying, "I need more emotional support," you might say, "I've been stressed about work lately," and see if they offer practical help or solutions. Instead of demanding, "I need to know where this relationship is going," you might ask about practical plans that would indicate their level of commitment. This approach requires patience and the ability to read between the lines, but it often provides more accurate information about their true feelings than direct emotional interrogation would. Avoidants are more likely to reveal their intentions through what they do consistently rather than what they say under pressure. The indirect approach also works better for addressing problems in the relationship. Instead of confronting them about their emotional distance, you might focus on specific behaviors that affect your daily life together. Instead of complaining about lack of affection, you might mention missing certain activities you used to do together. This isn't about manipulating them or avoiding honest communication. It's about communicating in a way that doesn't trigger their defensive systems so you can actually have productive conversations about real issues. Timing matters enormously with these conversations. Avoidants are more receptive to discussions when they don't feel cornered or ambushed. They respond better to conversations that happen naturally during other activities rather than formal sit-downs specifically about relationship issues. They're also more open when they don't feel like they're being put on the spot to perform emotions or make declarations they're not ready for. Creating space for them to share their perspective without pressure often results in more genuine insight into their thoughts and feelings than direct questioning would. One crucial aspect of dealing with avoidance that most people overlook is learning to maintain your own emotional well-being without depending on them to regulate your feelings. Avoidance can't be your primary source of validation, comfort, or emotional security without feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility. This isn't about them being selfish or incapable of caring. Their nervous system genuinely struggles with being responsible for someone else's emotional state. When you need them to make you feel better about yourself or the relationship, you trigger their deepest fears about being trapped by other people's emotional needs. Building genuine emotional independence means developing sources of validation and security that don't depend on their availability or responsiveness. This includes maintaining friendships that provide easy emotional connection, pursuing interests that fulfill you independently, and creating sources of satisfaction that exist whether they're in a good mood or a distant phase. Many people resist this because they think it means caring less about the relationship or holding back their investment. But emotional independence actually creates conditions where avoidance feels safer to offer what they can give. When they don't feel pressured to be your emotional lifeline, they're often more willing to share emotional moments spontaneously. This principle extends to how you handle their periodic need for space. When an avoidant withdraws, it's not because you did something wrong or because they don't care about you. It's because their system requires regular periods of independence to function well. Taking their withdrawal personally or trying to bridge the distance usually makes them need even more space. Instead, you can use their distant periods as opportunities to invest in other areas of your life. Spend time with friends who provide easy connection. Focus on personal projects that fulfill you. Engage in activities that remind you of who you are outside the relationship. When you can genuinely enjoy your independent time rather than just enduring it while waiting for them to reconnect, something shifts in the dynamic. They stop feeling guilty about their need for space, and you stop feeling rejected by their natural rhythm. This doesn't mean pretending you don't miss them or acting like their presence doesn't matter to you. It means building a life full enough that their temporary absence doesn't feel like abandonment. Many successful long-term relationships with avoidance follow this pattern. Both people maintain significant individual lives while choosing to share certain aspects of those lives together. They're not trying to merge into one person or meet all of each other's needs. They're building something that enhances both of their lives without overwhelming either person's capacity for connection. The sustainability of these relationships often depends on both people's ability to find satisfaction in this model rather than constantly wishing it was something different. When both people can appreciate what they have instead of focusing on what's missing, these relationships can be remarkably stable and fulfilling. But when one person is constantly trying to increase emotional intensity or create more traditional relationship dynamics, the avoidant usually starts planning their exit strategy. They can sense when someone is tolerating their natural way of being while hoping to eventually change it, and this pressure makes authentic connection impossible. The long-term success often comes down to genuine compatibility rather than one person adapting to the other's limitations. The healthiest relationships happen when the avoidant's natural offering aligns well with their partner's authentic needs, creating a dynamic that feels sustainable and satisfying for both people without requiring either person to fundamentally change who they are. There's something else you need to know about building lasting relationships with avoidance. They respond to consistency over time rather than grand gestures or emotional intensity. While others might be won over by passionate declarations or romantic surprises, avoidants are impressed by reliability, follow-through, and steady presence without drama. This means showing up consistently in small ways, rather than trying to create big emotional moments. It means being the same person whether they're in an open mood or a distant phase. It means proving your trustworthiness through actions over months and years, rather than trying to convince them through words or dramatic displays of devotion. Avoidants have often experienced relationships where initial intensity turned into pressure, where early romantic gestures became expectations for constant emotional performance, or where someone's initial acceptance of their independence eventually became resentment and attempts to change them. They've learned to be suspicious of people who come on too strong emotionally, because that intensity rarely sustains when the person realizes the avoidant won't reciprocate at the same level. Your ability to remain steady and consistent without requiring them to match your emotional output becomes one of your greatest assets in building trust with an avoidant. They need to learn through experience that you won't punish them for being who they are, that you won't gradually increase your emotional demands, and that you won't withdraw your affection when they go through their natural cycles of needing space. This consistency extends to how you handle conflicts and disagreements. Avoidants often shut down during emotional confrontations, not because they don't care about resolving issues, but because they feel overwhelmed by the emotional intensity and need time to process before they can engage productively. Learning to address problems calmly, give them space to think before expecting responses, and focus on practical solutions rather than emotional processing can make the difference between productive problem-solving and triggering their flight response. They're much more likely to work through issues when they don't feel cornered or overwhelmed by emotional pressure. Most importantly, you need to develop genuine appreciation for what avoidants bring to relationships when they're allowed to operate within their natural comfort zone. They tend to be incredibly loyal once they've committed to someone. They don't create unnecessary drama or emotional chaos. They're typically very honest and straightforward in their communication. They don't play games or use manipulation to get their needs met. These qualities create relationships that can feel refreshingly stable and drama-free compared to more emotionally volatile dynamics. But appreciating these strengths requires being honest about whether this type of relationship actually satisfies your emotional needs, rather than just being grateful that someone isn't causing problems. The goal isn't to convince yourself that you should be happy with whatever an avoidant can offer. The goal is to figure out whether their natural way of loving happens to align with what genuinely fulfills you in a relationship. Some people discover this alignment and build incredibly satisfying long-term partnerships. Others realize they need something different, and that's equally valid. Understanding how to work with avoidant patterns gives you the tools to make informed decisions about compatibility rather than spending years trying to force someone into a mold that doesn't fit their fundamental nature. Whether that leads to a lasting relationship or a respectful recognition of incompatibility, you'll be operating from clarity rather than frustration. One aspect of avoidant relationships that catches many people off guard is how different the progression looks compared to more traditional romantic timelines. While most relationships follow a pattern of increasing emotional intimacy and verbal affirmation over time, relationships with avoidance often develop more like slow-burning friendships that gradually deepen into something more significant. This means you might find yourself in a relationship where you spend significant time together, share daily routines, and clearly prioritize each other, but still rarely have conversations about feelings or future plans. The relationship develops through shared experiences and practical partnership rather than through emotional milestones and verbal commitments. For some people, this progression feels natural and comfortable. They prefer relationships that develop organically through actions rather than words, and they find the lack of pressure to constantly define and redefine the relationship refreshing. These people often discover that they can feel deeply secure in relationships that might look undefined to outside observers. But for others, this ambiguous progression creates significant anxiety. They need verbal confirmation of where they stand, regular discussions about the relationship's direction, and clear timelines for commitment. Trying to force these conversations usually backfires with avoidance, but going without them can feel impossible for people who need verbal reassurance to feel secure. This fundamental difference in how relationships should progress often determines compatibility more than other factors. If you need clear verbal communication about relationship status to feel secure, you're probably not well matched with someone whose natural tendency is to let relationships develop without explicit definition. Another crucial element that many people underestimate is how avoidance handles stress and external pressures. When life gets complicated, work pressure, family issues, health problems, avoidants typically withdraw even more than usual. Their instinct is to simplify their emotional landscape by reducing social and romantic obligations until they can handle their primary stresses. This withdrawal during difficult times can feel like abandonment to partners who expect increased support and connection during stress. But for avoidants, pulling back from relationships isn't rejection, it's self-preservation. They literally don't have the emotional bandwidth to manage both external stress and relationship demands simultaneously. Understanding this pattern helps you respond more effectively when they withdraw during difficult periods. Instead of taking their distance personally or trying to force connection during their most stressed moments, you can offer practical support without emotional expectations and give them space to handle their primary concerns. This doesn't mean accepting complete emotional abandonment during every difficulty, but it does mean recognizing that avoidants process stress differently and may need to handle major challenges largely on their own before they can re-engage relationally. Some partners find ways to be supportive during these periods by handling practical matters that might otherwise add to the avoidance stress load without expecting emotional reciprocity or deep conversations about feelings. Others discover that they need partners who turn toward them during difficult times rather than away, and that's equally valid. The sexual and physical intimacy aspects of relationships with avoidance often follow different patterns than emotional intimacy. Many avoidants can be quite physically affectionate and sexually connected while remaining emotionally distant. Physical intimacy doesn't trigger their autonomy fears the same way emotional vulnerability does. This can create confusing dynamics where you have strong physical and sexual connection, but struggle with emotional intimacy. Some people find this combination satisfying because the physical connection provides a sense of closeness and bonding even when verbal emotional expression is limited. Others find the disconnect between physical and emotional intimacy unsatisfying or confusing. They need emotional vulnerability and verbal connection to feel truly intimate, and physical connection without emotional openness feels incomplete. Understanding this distinction helps you assess whether the type of intimacy an avoidant can offer aligns with what you need to feel fulfilled in a relationship. Neither approach to intimacy is wrong, but they need to match for long-term satisfaction. The social aspects of relationships with avoidance also require different expectations. Avoidants often prefer to keep their romantic relationships somewhat separate from their broader social circles, at least initially. They may not introduce you to friends and family as quickly as other people would, and they might prefer to spend most of your time together one-on-one rather than in group settings. This preference for privacy isn't necessarily about hiding the relationship or being uncommitted. Many avoidants simply find that managing relationship dynamics in front of others adds a layer of complexity and potential pressure that feels overwhelming. They prefer to develop connection in private before adding social elements. Some partners appreciate this preference for intimate, private connection and find that they actually prefer relationships that don't require extensive social integration. Others need to feel included in their partner's broader life and social circles to feel secure and valued. The integration timeline with avoidance tends to be much slower than with other attachment styles. They may take months or even years to introduce romantic partners to important people in their lives, not because the relationship isn't serious, but because they prefer to be very certain about commitments before making them socially visible. One of the most challenging aspects of relationships with avoidance is learning to trust their actions over their words when it comes to commitment and investment. Avoidants rarely express their level of commitment verbally, but they demonstrate it through consistent behavior, practical partnership, and gradually increasing integration of your lives. This requires developing confidence in reading nonverbal cues and trusting behavioral patterns rather than needing explicit verbal confirmation. For people who are naturally good at reading actions and who don't need constant verbal reassurance, this can actually feel more secure than relationships with people who say the right things but don't follow through behaviorally. But for people who need verbal confirmation to feel secure, learning to trust actions without words can feel impossible. The lack of explicit commitment statements can create ongoing anxiety even when the person's behavior clearly indicates serious investment. The key is honest self-assessment about whether you can genuinely feel secure in a relationship where commitment is demonstrated through actions rather than words. Some people can make this adjustment and find it ultimately more satisfying. Others discover that they fundamentally need verbal expression of commitment and aren't compatible with partners who can't provide it. Finally, it's important to understand that successful relationships with avoidance often require releasing traditional relationship escalation timelines and expectations. The relationship may not follow typical patterns of increasing emotional intimacy, verbal commitment, and social integration according to conventional schedules. Instead, these relationships often develop their own unique rhythms and patterns that work for the specific people involved. Success depends on both people being able to appreciate what they're building together, rather than constantly comparing it to external relationship standards or timelines. This doesn't mean accepting indefinite uncertainty or settling for less than what you need. It means being open to relationships that might look different from traditional models while still meeting your authentic emotional needs. Some people discover that non-traditional relationship patterns actually suit them better than conventional approaches. Others realize they need more traditional progression and verbal expression to feel satisfied. Both discoveries are valuable because they help you make relationship choices based on what actually works for you rather than what you think should work based on cultural expectations. Have you found ways to build genuine connection with an avoidant partner while respecting their need for space? Share in the comments what approaches have worked for creating stability in these relationships. If this helped you understand how to work with avoidant patterns instead of fighting them, like this video and subscribe for more insights about making relationships work across different attachment styles. Thanks for watching.